Good evening, everyone. Well, you know, if anyone knows me, my name is Denise Simmons, Cambridge City Council, and if anyone knows me, I love this sort of call and response kind of thing. I say good evening, but I want to kind of get the vibrations in the room going. So I'm going to say good evening, and you can use your outside voices. You're going to say great evening. So, good evening. It is a great evening. It's a great evening because we are here to celebrate, remember, and to be educated by 4 extraordinary women. So I just want to begin by thanking everyone for coming out this evening to this special event, which we have entitled Claiming Our Seats, a kitchen table dialogue on women voting rights. I have to tell you, we have been looking forward to tonight for a very long time. We've all been collaborating over the last several months because we want to do something to really recognize the truly momentous national anniversary that is nearly upon us. Between now and next year, cities and towns across America will be holding special events to commemorate the passage of the 19th Amendment. This happened on August 18th, 1920, when finally, bestowed upon women was the right to vote. For those keeping score, this was 144 years after the signing of the Declaration of Independence. The fact that women were not allowed to vote and help choose their elected representatives from the very start of the Union for generations after our founding continues to be, I want to say, a mark of shame on our country. The Declaration of Independence is a flowery, idealistic body of work. Its language is about the equality of all and the desire to see everyone as treated equal. Yet these inspiring sentiments stood in stark contrast to the reality, because the reality was the founding fathers meant that all men were created equal. And this would only be true of those men if they happened to be white, wealthy, and a landowner. It took decades and decades for the women of this country. It took activism from the 1800s that laid the groundwork for the passage of the 19th Amendment. And all of us here, women and men alike, owe a debt of gratitude because they had helped this country move even closer to its founding ideas. I just point that out to say we're on the road, but it's been a long, slow, uphill road, particularly of women of color. And that is why I'm so excited to be here this evening and excited with who we have speaking with us this evening, because they're going to share and talk with us about the role of women and talk a little bit about how long we have struggled and still struggle.
Thank you, Councilor Simmons. Welcome. My name is Andrea Aswahe, and I'll be your moderator tonight. It is an honor to be here with these fabulous panelists. And I find this topic absolutely fascinating, but it's really essential to understanding our nation's political and activist history. This is an essential part of it, especially one based around the concept of intersectionality, which we'll discuss. Professionally, I am a producer and a reporter at WBUR. I produce a show called Kind World about extraordinary acts of kindness and compassion. And I really believe that an extraordinary act of kindness and compassion, the sheer act of acknowledgement, of inclusion, of accepting a new truth, a whole truth, I think that's a tremendous act of kindness and compassion. Personally, I'm an immigrant, I'm Latina, I'm a woman, and I'm a naturalized citizen of this country, which means that I have a superpower that many of us have, which is the right to vote. And many of us take this superpower for granted. Just this week, we had some local preliminary elections in Boston where only 11% of Boston voters casted a ballot. 11%. You know, we often overlook this tremendous effort, the sacrifice, and the work many visionaries fought for so we can exercise this right. And in school, we're taught the 19th Amendment, but in a very narrow way. We hear buzzwords, right, like suffragettes, Seneca Falls, names like Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. If you close your eyes and envision a suffragette, what does she look like? Does she look like a woman of color who was on the front lines, an indigenous person, a poor woman, an immigrant woman, a working mother? This isn't the image of a suffragette that we're taught or one that we jump to. And these are the women we'll be talking about tonight, the ones who've been overlooked by the history books, but who made these significant and lasting changes for people, their people, and for generations to come. The 19th Amendment tells us the right of citizens of the United States to vote shall not be denied or abridged by the US or by any state on account of sex. And on face value, that seems pretty inclusive, but we know that's not the full story. And we must amend this flawed and incomplete notion, and that's why we're here. And tonight, we're gonna start to dismiss those misconceptions and form a more nuanced discussion about the history and the future of suffrage equality in the US. As we look toward 2020, we look for the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but also another crucial presidential election. And as we look forward, we need to look back, and we need to consider how we got here, who paved the path, and where our nation's blind spots remain. So joining me tonight is this amazing panel. I have Reverend Irene Monroe, Dr. Lori Nsaya Jefferson, Dr. Jennifer Guglielmo. And we'll hear from each of them, but we'll also hear from you. We will have time for questions from the audience, so get thinking. I'd like to start by asking our panelists to introduce themselves and to tell us a little bit about their scholarship and work. So welcome our panel. First, we'll have Dr. Jennifer Guglielmo. We're gonna try to make this a little bit more informal, so I'm gonna call her Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for coming out today, and thank you to my co-panelists for doing this with me. I feel enormously honored to sit at the table with all of you and have this conversation. And I love the spirit of this event with the checkered tablecloth and just invoking the kitchen table as a sacred space, as a traditionally female space where women come together and share knowledge and wisdom and pass on stories from one generation to the next. And the kitchen table to me was always an enormously important and generative place. I was raised largely by my grandmother, who was the daughter of Italian immigrants, and she had an 8th grade education. She had to leave school early to work to support her family. She worked as a domestic worker. She had 11 children, and she was my greatest teacher, and her table was like the place everybody wanted to be. It was really tiny in her kitchen, always filled with food, and I learned more there at her knee than I've ever learned anywhere. And so her inspiration and the inspiration of her generation informed my scholarship. The first book I wrote was called Living the Revolution. It was a book about Italian women's resistance and radicalism in New York City in the early 20th century. And I sought to recover histories of political radicalism that had been intentionally buried because they were seen as anti-American. And as Italians came to get a sense of the terrain and understand what it meant to live in a country like the US that was founded on anti-blackness and anti-indigeneity and white supremacy, they had to distance and disassociate from anything that resembled those things, and they accepted and began to enact white identities. And I, as a person who grew up in New York City in the 1970s and 80s, grew up with enormous tension and violence between Italians and communities of color, and I wondered why that was. And so my research led me to answer that question and understand what are the costs of becoming American for European immigrants who internalized and enact white racial identities, and then what was the role of women? What did that mean for women who had been drawn to multiracial, radical, anti-capitalist, anti-racist movements? The first generation was largely committed to those movements. They were anarchists, they were socialists, they saw themselves as workers of the world. And so I looked at how that happened, right? That they left those traditions behind as they accepted these new identities, but also how those traditions remained in people like myself, but also in other ways. Those traditions persist, I think. Currently, I'm working with the National Domestic Workers Alliance. I am helping them to build a political education curriculum that is helping to bring history to nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers. We're using digital technologies like digital smartphone accessible digital timelines to help workers access their histories of organizing so that they can use history as an organizing tool. And I think that as I'm about a year and a half into this more intensive phase of the project, I think this is going to become a book that brings together these histories into one single narrative that connects Black women's histories with Indigenous, Latina, European immigrant, and Asian immigrant histories, so that we can kind of see them together as and connected to each other. So thank you for having me.
Thank you, Jennifer. Lori?
Good evening. I'm really excited about being here today. I've been looking forward to this evening for quite some time. This particular evening allowed me to reflect and think about my heritage, my past, my future, and that of my children. So what came to my mind first was thinking about the songs of the Gullah people. My grandmother, Lydia Hargrove Jefferson, was born in Dale, South Carolina, a hop, skip, and jump from St. Helena Island, where the Gullah people lived. Gullah women were intentional and they were strong. The Gullah believed that the dead, the living, and the unborn coexist. Perhaps that is also true of the process of thinking about, in my case, African American women claiming their seat at the table. So as we think about women of color in suffrage historically and in the present, we must begin to see how gaining the vote and retaining and exercising the vote are tied to current and past policies and structures which would like to restrain our voices and bury our spirits. And that's really, really important, that when we think about voting and how important it is and how it really connects to our needs, our wants, our circumstances, to restrain our voices and to bury our spirit as our voices are restrained is very, very tragic. And it's something that's critically important for us to keep in mind, however uncomfortable it might be. For Black women writers, the trope of the ancestor has been a touchstone in our narratives. As Farah Jessamine Griffin discusses, the African American narrative is often necessary to invoke the past. It's a way in which we remember, and it's important that we continue to remember our past. And one of the things that we're doing this evening is remembering the past in order to inform our futures. So one of the things I think is really important is that invoking ancestors is fundamental in Gullah. And so what does an ancestor do? And when I'm thinking about ancestors, I'm thinking about our past story and our past narratives. It is a role that fulfills comfort and guidance. If we look at our ancestors, they provide us with comfort, they provide us with guidance. And one of the things that I've been doing for the last 2 years, and it's a little bit curious to me, my mother died in 2014, so that's been about 5 years. And almost every time I publicly speak, I bring my mother to the public. And so she's my closest female ancestor, Lily Bell. She was Southern born, East Coast raised, African American mother who chewed on focusing on the needs of children of color in a predominantly white school district of Newton, Massachusetts as a METCO director. She was also a social activist in the NAACP, Church Women United, the National Council of Negro Women, and our local church. She mentored, she taught. She co-created speeches with my dad for his political campaign. So it's very interesting. She was writing a lot of his speeches, although he had a lot to say too. She wrote poetry and she served on many boards and committees trying to right the wrong of racism, sexism, and community apathy when it came to multiculturalism. She was slight in size, but powerful in word and deed. I'm not going to say much more, but this is also very strange and interesting when I tell people. I barely cried when she passed because I found profound comfort in her indelible legacy. Her funeral was a time of learning so much more about her. I heard stories and stories and stories of her ways of being in a community. She was a community mother, she was an other mother. She not only claimed a spot at the table, she took it and she owned it. So our kitchen table is fully connected to the work she and my dad did outside the house. My father was the first black man to serve on the board of aldermen in Newton, and my mother was as more or well known as he was. And if she had run, I'm sure she would have won, evidenced by her awards and recognitions that came her way. I could say more, but I know that we're just introducing ourselves, and I can give you a little bit more of my thoughts as we go forward. And what I do, I bring my legacy and my history to the work as a director for the Center for Women in Politics and Public Policy, because again, they were my inspiration. And whatever I do, I say that women and people of color must be included strongly in our communities, and they must have a voice. And one of the things that we do at our center is that we use an intersectional lens to provide education, opportunities, and convenings that address issues of political empowerment and representation for women in general and women of color and low-income women particularly.
Thank you, Lori.
Hi, I'm Reverend Irene Monroe, and people always want to know what I do. Oh, see, I have a loud voice here. So I'm Reverend Irene Monroe. That sounds very loud, but that's all right. People ask what I do, so I'll just tell you very briefly. On a good day, I'm a reverend. On Mondays, you could hear me on WGBH. I do a segment called All Revved Up, and now this is the plug. I now have a podcast. Listen to the podcast, All Revved Up here. But I'm here, and if I had some tech savvy, I would show the person who has shaped my activism around voting, and that's Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm represented my area in Brooklyn, New York, and she was a congresswoman in Brooklyn from 1969. There's no picture. I didn't bring any pictures, so just do a mental picture here, okay, and see me as her mentee, okay? But she served my district from 1969 to 1983. And she was a force to be reckoned with, not only in my district, but in the halls of power in New York City. She was the title of her book, and she was definitely this, Unbought and Unbossed, the name of her 1970 memoir. There's a quote by, and I'm a Democrat because of Shirley Chisholm, my spouse and I. We are a divided household. She's not a Republican because I wouldn't be with her, I assure you, but she's an independent, but I'm a Democrat. And I said to her just the other day as I was preparing for this, I says that sometimes when you catch a child when they're young, they can't, you just feel indebted to that person. And even though I feel like the Democratic Party takes black votes, and particularly black women's votes, for granted, I can't change that because I always hear Shirley Chisholm's voice. And I want to share this particular quote by Shirley. She says that the next time a woman runs, or a black or a Jew, or anyone from a group that the country is not ready to elect to its highest office, I believe that he or she will be taken seriously from the start. I ran because somebody had to do it first. There you go. In this country, everybody is supposed to be able to run for president, but that has never really been true, and that is absolutely true. But what I want to talk about, because we do have not only the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, but we also have an election year here. And one of the things that Donald Trump said, he says that, why do, he said this, that the Democratic Party takes the black people for granted here. So one of my reasons that I'm a Democrat, I'll say this, that during Reconstruction, this was right after the Civil War, we were supposedly promised reparations, 40 acres and a mule. And we never got that mule. So I decided, as a Democrat, I'm gonna ride this donkey as far as I can. All right, but I'm also want to talk about basically the black woman's vote. So in 2017, when slave apologist Roy Moore was running for the Senate against Doug Jones here, black women got lauded as backbone. So while that is supposed to be a compliment, I want you to know that we're nobody's backbones but our own. It suggests that we don't have a voting mobilization strategy. It suggests that we just here to rescue white men in red districts. But the point about it is, I want to talk about this very quickly here, is that what happens is that while we need a kind of intersectional activism here, it has never happened, okay? So let's do a little historical walk back to Seneca Falls. We all love Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but truth be told, she could care less about black women like Betty Friedan. She was only, trying to get the vote for black women. She and Frederick Douglass, had a contentious relationship, largely because during the Reconstruction, we had these Reconstruction amendments, the 13th, 14th, and 15th. 13th in slavery, so they say. 15th said they give us full citizenship, and then the 15th was the whole idea that black men had the right to vote. And so at Seneca Falls, they invited Frederick Douglass, but they didn't invite any black women. Then we moved to 1851 when we have the big women's convention in Akron, Ohio, and they invite Sojourner Truth. And we all know Sojourner for that wonderful quote, "Ain't I a woman?" But the interesting thing about it, and Nell Painter, who is a retired professor at Princeton, said this whole notion that, as she was saying, "Ain't I a woman?" Is that she took her top off and bared her chest, and that's not true. So I say this to say that what happens is this: when you have a single story, that what you miss is the segregated knowledge of folks that are very much on the front line, whose bodies and souls have been taken for granted here. We know that with Fannie Lou Hamer at the 1964 Democratic Convention here. She's sick and tired because, like most black women and most black people, white women and white people only want us for a photo op moment. But want our votes, but not our vices, okay? Want us to cast that ballot, okay? But are not concerned about our interests here. So the point is that I'm hoping that when you leave here today, okay, and I'm not asking you to be my friend, I'm asking you to do this, that we got one collective goal up in here, is to remove Trump from office. And the one thing I have always said, the power of the people is greater than the people in power. That's what I need you for. I need you to fight until hell freezes over, and then I need you to help me fight on the ice. So if we're going to really have this conversation, let's have this conversation and tell the truth, okay? And one other thing, and let's remember, 53% of white women voted for Donald Trump. So what does that mean? That means that that's not the work that I have to do. That means that you white women have to go and have that conversation, because it's a family affair. It's not my business, because I make sure that my business, who is Dr. Thea James, vote, even though we disagree. Ain't that right, honey?
Thank you, Cyrene. So kind of playing off of what you just said, Laura, you mentioned the notion of intersectionality. I kind of alluded to it. Can you give us just a really brief explanation of what that is and how it makes this issue even more complex when we look at how different groups have different priorities. They have different
Yes.
goals in mind. Each group isn't even, within the group is not a monolith. So we need to look at the differences that we have in class, race, gender, etc.
I want your notes.
I got a lot of notes, yeah. Well, one of the things I want to mention before I even get to the intersectionality piece, but this is part of intersectionality, when we think about women coming from different experiences and different perspectives. So one of the things that I've been thinking about a lot, and I actually went to the Congressional Black Caucus Foundation annual legislative conference a couple of weeks ago. So there were probably about between 5,000 and 7,000 black people in one place. And they were all talking about policy and also talking about political empowerment. And Donna Brazile was at that particular meeting, and she's written a book about, women, black women of color daring to run. And one of the things that was really important, that really came through, was we are women of color in America, which means our lives, our very existence in this country is political. It is political because of the decisions that have been made for us in our community, decisions that influence and impact our lives and the options available to us. So it's the options that we have, the impact on our lives. We have not had the pleasure of living our lives distinctly separate from the political decisions that were made before we were even born. Decisions that determine where our ancestors lived and also where in their life and their being was. This was impacting our grandparents and our parents and where our siblings are and where they live, places that we could afford to live, the schools that we attended, the career choices that we made. One of the things that I remember as a little girl was watching Barbara Jordan during the Watergate hearings. I remember Shirley Chisholm. Shirley Chisholm was really strong and big in my home because she was an African American woman. And my mother and my father always wanted me to listen to those women. So one of the things that I think is really important is over the years, we've thought about Shirley Chisholm, Barbara Jordan, Ida B. Wells, Fannie Lou Hamer, Wilma Mankiller, Patsy Mink. There in Massachusetts, we had Charlotte Gola Ritchie, and I also want to recognize Alice Wolfe because Charlotte Gola Ritchie and Alice Wolfe are Distinguished Public Service Fellows with the CWPP program in our center. So I wanted to make sure that I recognized Alice for the wonderful work that she does. But what's really interesting is we have Doris Bunty, Marie Lafleur, we have Linda Darcini Foray. So we have individuals that are in our current as well as our past history. And one of the things that's interesting about these women is that they had the vision. They knew and they imagined. And how that relates to intersectionality is in two ways. So when we think about the vote, one of the things that's really, really important is that when they talk about the fact that women vote more than men vote, one of the things that's really important is we have to begin to ask ourselves, what women are we talking about? And we're not just looking at that by race and gender, even within race and gender. So if we're looking at voting patterns of women, we have to say high-income women versus low-income women. We're talking about African-American women. We have to talk about and think about whether we're talking about educated women, less educated women. We have to think about the geography. We have to think about the resources within those communities. So it's really important that when a big statistic is thrown out saying, that there's greater voting or voter registration or political participation, whatever the variable might be, it's important that we think about the fact that that's one general statistic. And if we don't dig down deep, we're never going to get a sense of where the challenges are as well as the opportunities. So that's really critically, very, very important. And it's really interesting, even when we begin to think about suffrage, and we think about, why women, black women versus white women wanted the vote, it was a little bit for different reasons. So black women and white women likely had different reasons for seeking the right to vote. White women wanted the vote as a symbol of equality with white men. Black women were seeking the right to vote for themselves and for black men as a way to empower their communities as a whole. So the mainstream women's suffrage movement excluded the voices, as you mentioned before, black and brown people. So again, when we're even thinking about history, you have to think about who are we talking about. But what I really want to stress more than anything is sometimes people think, okay, it's black women versus white women versus Latino women versus whatever it might be. But it's also intersections within your community. And if you're trying to empower and educate and inspire, we have to take different ways of doing that depending on the population that you're working with. So I hope that's a broad population.
Jennifer, do you want to add to that?
So in my classes and in my research, I think about what does history look like when we center women of color and all poor and working class women. How does that change the way we think about history? Suffrage as a goal, as a movement, shifts from the center stage. Suddenly there's no longer two waves, right? I think this notion of two waves of feminist history is really centered on white middle class women's history and excludes everyone else. And puts suffrage as kind of the centerpiece of 19th century organizing, and decenters all the other kinds of organizing that were happening, like Ida B. Wells and the anti-lynching movement, or movements for indigenous sovereignty, or movements against the exclusion of Chinese, Japanese, and then South Asian immigrants, anarchist and socialist movements, right, working labor movements. So, and then the second wave too, right? It kind of, when you focus on women's liberation, it erases, like, where do the women of the Montgomery bus boycott fit into that, right, rubric, right? And I think if we broaden suffrage, right, if we take an intersectional lens, which is to take seriously race, class, gender, sexuality as interconnected, as deeply influencing each other, then we have to think about suffrage in new ways, right? As folks have been articulating, as what does it mean to vote in a church meeting or in your community organization? And black women, as Elsa Barkley Brown has taught us, right, were exercising the right to vote in their communities long before white women were, right, in community settings, and saw the vote, once black men achieved the vote with the 15th Amendment, saw the vote as collective. And they were teaching the movement about how to expand understandings of suffrage. And as you were saying, right, these different notions, the way the suffrage movement divided, you have black women who are seeking suffrage to empower their communities, and white women who are seeking suffrage to empower their community, but their community was, right, upholding white supremacy, upholding capitalism, upholding imperialism. And so they were wanting to be partners in these systems of power that were wreaking enormous havoc on most poor, working class, most women of color. So to me, an intersectional analysis asks that we look really, really differently at our histories, and that we move other people to the center stage and learn from them, somebody like Ida B. Wells, right, for whom suffrage was important, but anti-lynching was the focus of her movement. She had to end, right, the violence, and it wasn't just lynching, she was also talking about rape, right, the rape of black women at the hands of white men, which was, right, pervasive, and still is pervasive, right, the rape of women of color in this country. And so, right, suffrage suddenly becomes in conversation, and then we also have to think about power in relationship to the white women who were seeking more power through the vote, right? And I'll just end with saying how the Klan, the Ku Klux Klan, becomes a mass-based social movement in the 1920s, right? Mass-based. Millions of people are joining it, and a lot of them are white women newly empowered with the vote, and see the Klan as their avenue to express that new sense of political subjectivity, right? The Klan has a WKKK, a women's Ku Klux Klan. Yeah.
Yeah. I think they also had a Ku Klux Klan, like, children's division.
Yeah. Yeah. It
Yeah,
was.
but we got the Ku Klux Klan here. They just don't wear hoods, okay?
Well,
Yeah.
And some of them are just, we call them liberal whites.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the Klan morphs into this particular era, you
Yeah.
know? So, I mean, when we talk about intersectionality, I smile, because it's a terminology now that is certainly out in the American lexicon, and everyone uses it around as confetti, you know? But the point is that Audre Lorde talked about it in Sister Outsider, you know? Bell Hook talked about it, and in terms of, you know,
Yeah.
talked about it, and now we get Kimberly Crenshaw. But let me tell you what I think about it. This is the one thing I've learned. You live long enough, as I say to my spouse, you done seen everything, okay? And it repeats itself, and sometimes I think it's stuck on stupid, but that's all right. But, you know, politics are local. So let me tell you why I vote for Denise Simmons. Okay, she gets my number one vote. I hope you don't mind this, Denise, okay? Even if the sister, look, even if I didn't like the sister, I'd give her my vote for this reason. Well, it's nice that, you know, I can look at her and I could say, like, okay, you know, I see me in her. But she's interested in the school board, okay? I'm a kid that grew up with, you know, through the public school system. So even though that Cambridge is resource rich, okay, this is someone that understands the importance. Not everybody can go to BB&N, okay? So she understands that there's an income disparity here, all right? So while everybody today is talking about climate change, see? Now, I know Denise is going to talk about environmental racism, all right? And she will want to know why, if not here, why in Flint there's no clean water, and why in the South Bronx there's a disproportionate group of Latinos with asthma because their housing complex is on a dump. So my thing is this here. I love intersectionality. We saw that with the sort of third wave movement here. Although I felt like I was a fly in a bowl of milk, because you saw all these white women. So this is what I say here, because it's wonderful to talk about suffrage. Let's talk about, okay, sisterhood. This is what I want, okay? If you are interested in environmental, the climate change, other than the water coming into your basement, I want you to think about it in terms of how it affects people of color. You know, if your interest is abortion, I want you to think about how does that affect people of color. I want that if your interest is immigration, I want you to expand your lens, okay, and look to the border of what is happening. So my point is this: you're not going to get rid of your white privilege, all right? Let's be real about that, okay? Power has to be taken. I do anti-racism workshops. I ask white people all the time, how are you white and how white are you? And they give me the white haze, like, huh? Okay, so the point about it is I've done enough of this, okay? This is what I want. We want the same thing. We're under this umbrella called America, all right? And we definitely want the same, we want this president out of office. So this is how it works for me, all right? I wanted, you know, Hillary when she ran, not only because she's from my alma mater, Wellesley, but I wanted her because she had we had similar interests. Elizabeth Warren is running, okay? I know sister ain't hang out with no sisters, okay? As a matter of fact, and you know, we know that story about Native Americans and how she used that to advance her career, you know, and could have easily gotten over that sort of lie easily by just saying, my mama told me this, but that's another story. What I want is, are you interested? You do not have to come to my table. You do not have to be my girlfriend. I just want to know, are we in this same boat together around making a much more sort of inclusive society and a participatory democracy? Now, if you want to be my friend, fine. If you don't, that too is fine. That's all I want.
Well, off of that, let's talk a little bit about barriers.
Okay.
Barriers, historic barriers that have disenfranchised people of color, women, minority groups, marginalized groups, and some that are still around. So, Jennifer, do you want to start?
I'll start by saying, because I didn't answer your question as relates to immigrants, but I think it's so profound that we live in a moment right now where over 10 million people are undocumented and don't have access to citizenship, right? And so to me, that is, right, one of the most powerful forms we have right now of disenfranchisement that is happening, right? Is that there aren't pathways to citizenship, right? For the many people who are migrating here, in large part because of U.S., right, colonial and imperial policies. And so I think that is one major form of exclusion from political participation, right? Our low-wage folks of color, right? And so that's just one, I think, contemporary form that we're witnessing right now is what is the resistance to creating pathways of citizenship? Why is there so much fear generated about immigrants today, right? And just that intention of keeping them out of participating, out of organizing, keeping folks in a state of fear so they can't even go to the grocery store without feeling like they're going to get arrested and deported and detained, right, in these horrific conditions. So I think historically we know, right, that suffrage has always been an exclusive category, even after, right, after the 19th Amendment was passed, right, through poll taxes, through literacy tests, through intimidation, through outright violence, gunning people down at the polls, right? I'm thinking of like the Wilmington Massacre, right, in North Carolina, right, that, black folks would show up at the polls and white folks would be there with guns drawn and, right, assassinate everybody who came to the poll that day. And so I think that voting has always, even though there have been laws on the books, right, that grant people the right to vote, there's always been ways de facto that folks have been excluded from political participation.
And I think the other piece that's really important is to think about mass incarceration.
Please.
And we clearly know that
Yeah.
it's people of color, particularly African Americans, but people of color who are incarcerated. And you might say, well, how does that impact on women? One of the things that we know is that women are the fastest growing group of people in prison. And again, it's women of color, black women particularly. So at the end of the day, clearly you're not voting when you're in prison. And in most instances, except in some states, you are not voting when you get out of prison. So I think those are some really important things in terms of thinking about barriers. I mean, some of the other barriers that we might not think about, and there's subtle ways in which people, and particularly women, are not able to vote. So you think about the fact that you've got to go to work, and sometimes you're working 12 hours a day. You're working 2 or 3 different shifts depending on what day it is. So the question is, when do you have the time nor the energy or the inclination to vote? When you're just trying to hold it down and get food on the table and get your kids where they need to go. There's also the thing when you think about women in terms of transportation. So it depends on where these polling locations are at. And again, the time that you may have to be able to get there. And then there's subtle intimidation by employers. So if you're in a low-level job, is my mic on?
Yep.
If you're in a low-level job, you might be afraid to ask your boss or your superior, can I take time, or can I come in a little bit later or a little bit earlier? You're just not even at that point where you can do that, although there's a right of you to be able to vote, and your employer should let you. But again, if you're intimidated or you're afraid that you're going to lose your job, and if you lose your job, you are going to not be able to put food on the table. Again, these things are really important. And then there's something that we might not think about either, and that's around established norms of families and communities. In some instances, women are expected to or told to vote the same way their husbands are. So you might say to yourself, well, wait a minute, I'm in that booth by myself. So he doesn't necessarily have to know. Well, he could be hovering around the booth, or you're so daggone scared that you're not going to vote that way anyway, whether or not someone's looking. And then there's also the lack of voter education. I'm not sure who to vote for. Or maybe it gets something, it can actually be feeling like you don't have a choice, even though there are choices, because of the fact that there's no one that you feel is representing who you are. You know, you're a woman of color, and you might be saying, depending on where you are, is there anybody who's going to recognize my needs? And we hear this all the time about people feeling like it's hopeless and why make a difference? And there's still a lot of people that are in that boat. So that, again, behooves us to say, what are we going to do to make sure that women and people of color feel as though there's somebody and something worth voting for?
Yeah. So in February of this year, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell voiced his opposition to making Election Day a federal holiday.
That's
so I'm
right.
hoping that some of you will think about H.R. 1. It's called for the People Act of 2019. But these are the things that I think that we can address. These are some of the tactics. I call them Jim Crow tactics
That's right.
here, even though we don't have a literacy test or a poll taxes to pay. But this is it. Changing voting locations, random voter roll purging, changing polling hours, eliminating early voting days, reducing the number of polling places, packing majority-minority districts, dividing minority districts, and then the notorious voter ID here. This is the kind of work I think that if we want this kind of what we call participatory democracy here, is that we can go out and do this work. We had the freedom rides back in the 60s, and I think that we really have to drive a voter registration. We also have to educate people how to really be smart voters. And as I had said previously, you don't have to like the person. You have to, your taxes pay to be represented. Does this person represent my interests? And we have to hold our elected officials, accountable here. So one of the things that I'm hoping that we will do here is that we will get behind one candidate once they weed out. I think how many left we got. I don't know how many we got left, but when it gets down, and it may not be who we want. It might be Buttigieg. I can't pray. Mayor Pete. Buttigieg. Okay. It might be that we may not like him. Okay. But if it's going to push our cause, by all means, you may not like Elizabeth Warren, but if it's going to get what we need done to move forward, as progressive voters, then we need to do this. We're not going to be, as I say, inviting them out for a drink.
So I think on that note, we want to start taking some questions from you all. If you have, I think we have a mic set up right here. If you're interested in asking a question, our panelists are ready to answer.
As a member of a group trying to reinvigorate the League of Women Voters here in Cambridge, we hope to attract lots of people in this extraordinary year coming up. So if you had to say one thing on the top of your head, say if you're faced with a 22-year-old thinking, does my vote matter this year? Of all the things you said, what would you say to this individual?
Is this to me? Oh,
anyone who wants
okay.
to,
Well,
I'd love to hear.
I would tell this 22-year-old, your vote is important because not to vote, you're participating in your own oppression.
What I would say, what I would ask is, what matters to you? What's important? What makes you mad? What makes you feel like you can't sleep at night? Where do you see the injustices? I would have them to reflect upon their life, their circumstances, and what's important to them. Because I think that if you don't have an intrinsic passion or strong interest, you're not going to vote. There has to be some kind of personal connection to your needs, your wants, and your values.
Yeah, I guess, I don't know, maybe I would draw on guilt, but just to say, because I always feel as if you vote for your ancestors who couldn't vote too, right? So many generations who fought to be able to vote, who laid their lives on the line, who lost their lives, so that we could vote. So even whenever I'm feeling even depressed about the choices or the options, I get myself out there to honor them. And so that too, using that argument, I think can be critical. And for the people, as we just said, who can't vote, all the undocumented, all the incarcerated, all the disenfranchised, right? If you have the privilege to be able to vote, it's your responsibility to be able to use it on behalf of their liberation, right?
But can I just say this? I do think that with a younger generation, I mean, we saw this just Friday with young school kids, concerned about climate change. I mean, it just needs one thing. And I think if we tell them, look, you won't be able to breathe, that might certainly turn things for them.
So my question is this. 53% of white women voted for Trump, even though they was aware of all his negative interactions with women. Why? Is there a way that you can give us an answer? I know you can't speak for every white woman, but what was...
Well, I will.
Okay, all right.
I will speak for every white woman. No, I think what it taught us was the power of whiteness. The power of whiteness to mobilize people's identities and sympathies and actions, that it's so powerful, those privileges and powers that it holds out, and all the entitlements that come with it, that it overpowered that sense of the egregiousness of putting, somebody who's more than a lecher, right? Somebody who's a sexual predator, right, in the office. And I think that we see how race can trump gender over and over again historically, and that's what's happening.
Yeah. And I'm trying to understand it. I mean, there were two things. One, we never thought that the browning of America, that was going to be easy transition. But what I'm trying to understand is white evangelicals. And I like to say to them that, the Christian right need to speak to the right Christians, because I don't know what kind of God they're serving, unless it's called white supremacy.
I have a little bit of a follow-up to that, which is, how can we begin to dismantle this? This is obviously, an issue for, the vote, these this voting bloc. So how do you begin to dismantle this sense, like you said, this, the power of whiteness?
You know what? I have a Bible for white people to read. It's by Robin DiAngelo, called White Fragility. Because what happens here is that white guilt, crying, saying, I don't know, I don't have a sense of identity, is not going to help move or dismantle white supremacy. I always remember what King said. He said it's not only the vitriol of the bad people, but it is the silence of the good white folks. So we need you to have language. We need you to get rid of white guilt and stop crying, and do some work around dealing with using your privilege for the good.
I think that one of the things history has taught me about how do we work on misogyny and work on white supremacy within ourselves and with our communities is that we start where we are at, right? Wherever we are is the ground to do this work. Within our families, within our workplaces, within our friendship circles, right? We have to just engage. I think we live in a world that throws so much at us every day, and it can be paralyzing and debilitating. But we have to find a way to confront these systems and ideas on a regular basis. And I think if we take seriously the everyday, right? I mean, that's what history teaches me, is that like the end of slavery, right? That didn't happen overnight. That was the everyday people's, black folks organizing on an everyday basis to build themselves up, to build their communities up, and to overthrow a system, right? That Lincoln did not freed nobody. He did it. It was an after effect. The enslaved people freed themselves, right? And I think when there's a reason why we haven't been taught history in that way, right, is because there is a goal to distance. There is a way that power doesn't want us to understand the power that we have in the everyday, the power that we all possess in ourselves and in our communities to unravel enormous systems like the institution of slavery, right? If that could be brought down to its knees, as the Reverend reminded me
I want
earlier,
my
too.
reparations, and I want it now.
Right? We can end this system, right? We can end this system. We have to all commit ourselves and participate in it. And so I think about misogyny, what it means to end misogyny. I think it's so interconnected, right, with ending white supremacy. We can't end one without the other. They're deeply interwoven with, or classism, right? They're deeply interwoven. We have to see them as interconnected and topple them in ourselves and in our immediate communities as dramatically as we can, right? And so what does that mean? It means really intending to do that work on a daily basis and seeing where it shows up, where it reveals itself to you. whether it's in a conversation with a family member, or whether it's, for me, it's in the classroom, or it's in the way I interact with my colleagues, or it's in the things I decide to say yes to and the things I decide to say no to. It's how I take care of myself, how I refuse, how I notice and become more conscious of where those things are operating within my own psyche, and say no to them within myself, right?
For white women who have black and brown nannies or caretakers, and they're women, one thing you can do is begin to sort of empower that woman about the importance of coming out and voting, and share with her why you vote, who you're voting for. You can have that just very simple conversation, that this is an election year, who might you be voting for? And it may not be the same candidate, and it'd be interesting to hear why she might not vote because of the restrictions around getting to a voting poll, or why she's choosing a particular kind of candidate. That's a kind of easy conversation, because that sister is in your house just about every day, taking care of your child.
Yeah, or pay her for the day. Say, you know what, on Tuesday's a voting day, you have that day, I'm paying you, it's a paid day off so that you can go vote, right? I mean, to understand kind of how we can also, and I think, more and more people are employing nannies, house cleaners, and home care workers, and to recognize that those labor relationships are a way you can participate in dismantling these systems. I recommend, there's 2 websites you can go to. There's the National Domestic Workers Alliance, has a wonderful links to contracts, so that if you're hiring, if you need to hire a nanny or home care worker or house cleaner, you can look at what are the contracts that workers themselves have designed that help these labor relations, or hand in hand, a domestic employers network. That's another wonderful website. They too have sample contracts for each of these 3 sectors. And I think I'm glad you brought that up. That's such an important way, I think, that all of us can kind of participate in shifting, right? The incredible devaluation of work that was, right, traditionally assigned to women, and primarily women of color.
Yeah.
Question.
Yeah, thank you very much. I wanted to ask you about, first of all, I think in the last election, the percentage of people who actually voted was somewhere between 50 and 60%. So how do we get turnout? Turnout seems to me to be absolutely critical. And do we address it in a systemic way? Like in other countries, it's required to vote. It's a law that you have to vote. And how can we raise, are there systemic ways that we can approach the whole issue of turnout?
Let's take that.
I'm always talking, so I'm waiting for the. Okay, so you're talking about systemic change here, right? So I gave a list of some of the problems that makes it very difficult, impedes people of color to get to the ballot here. I think that, so Cambridge has a pretty secure ballot system here, but I think, just those of us who will go out and canvass and stuff, I'm hoping that, I find it very interesting that that you'll get folks, and it's usually white folks, they'll go out to New Hampshire, they'll go out to canvass, but they won't do canvassing in Mattapan, Dorchester, or Roxbury. Okay, now we're saying that the black vote is important. A lot of those folks, their vote is disenfranchised. So if you really want the Commonwealth of Massachusetts to be that beacon on the hill, we can always start at home, and home is just across this river.
Well, actually, that's something I wanted to ask, which is, what kind of actions can we take? One action that we can actually do that can, get more women, more people of color, more people from marginalized minority communities to the polls? What is something that each and every person can do to kind of fulfill that lofty goal?
My sense is that, whenever there's a challenge, you have to take a multi-pronged approach. So there's not any one way to do it. I think that we have to, one, make sure that there are candidates that will fulfill the needs and the concerns of the individuals. And that means that we have to mobilize people in our communities who may not feel like they are quote unquote fit to run. One thing that we know is that you have to ask a woman 7 times before she thinks she's ready to run or that she will accept. For men, sometimes they might not be qualified at all, but they're like, I'm going for it. So I think it's important that we mobilize people who have the interest in the experience. And the experience might be that they were on the PTA. The experience might be that they're concerned about and have worked hard for their children. So that's one thing that I think is really important. The other thing is that we get many types of community-based organizations that may not be organizations that focus specifically on voting, but recognizing that if you're in a community, that should be the responsibility of your organization to make sure that that happens. I think the other thing that's really very, very important is that we make sure that we bring people, give people the opportunity to come together to talk and to converse, because you want them to become empowered, interested, and exciting about it. I think the other piece that's also very important is civic education, and civic education starting from a very young age. And civic education does not have to just happen within schools. Civic education can also happen in churches, it can happen in community centers, it can happen in an awful lot of places. So I think that these are some, but again, there are many others.
So another thing we have to do, it's one thing to get us out to vote. So this is one of my pet peeves here. So you will always get white politicians pimping the black vote, because they will come to your church on Sunday, that Tuesday before Election Day, and want your vote. And so we got to educate, like you said, to have elected officials engage with their community. So like if I'm upset, Denise will tell you, I called Denise, I called the police, I called the fire department, I called everybody, okay? Even the Attorney General of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, because I feel like I'm a citizen in this state and that my elected officials are working on my behalf. That's why you're gonna get my #1 vote again, okay? And Denise, I got a problem.
I'm having a little bit of trouble formulating the question, but how do we get white men in these rooms the way we always are? Because I feel like white men are still benefiting from the privilege of getting treated like a sleeping baby while we quietly talk in the next room and we're careful not to wake them up. And we all know what we've had to do to be the women that we are in the society that we live in. But who's challenging the white men today? Because, you know, you can have Mayor Buttigieg, sorry if I'm mispronouncing the name, show up at the food truck and eat the soul food and kiss a black baby or whatever have you. But I still feel like we're handling white men with kid gloves. And yes, we are sort of the recipients of the oppression, but how is it that it's 2019, we have Me Too now. We have, you know, in doing a lot of the research around looking at suffrage, we're still fighting a lot of these same fights now. So is it the next kitchen table conversation, everybody bring a white man with you, you know what I mean? Find a white man and bring him with you, because they cannot still have as much privilege as they have. And so how do we start to address that?
How do we remove the kid gloves? I like that. No, go ahead.
Well, they're afraid of me, so they stay away.
I mean, I think one of the things when I think about this, and I think about this not just in terms of white men, but I think about any group that is not marginalized. There's something very, very profound about giving up your power. And I think that that's what's very difficult, because at the end of the day, again, it's human nature to want to hold on to all the power that you have, because power provides you with benefits. So I think we need to have very, very honest conversations about power and the distribution of power and what that means when certain groups are holding more power than others. And again, I think this is going to be something that's a very, very, very difficult challenge by virtue of what I was just saying. It's human nature to want that. So at the end of the day, one of the things that I've always been taught is what's in it for me? Why should I do something? And I'm not necessarily saying that I think that's the tack to take, but at the end of the day, if you think about critical race theory, one of the things they say in terms of critical race theory is that people only give up power if it's going to benefit them. So, you know, put a pin in that and think about it. I don't really have an answer other than we have to have some honest conversations and power has to be redistributed, and how that happens to me is very, very difficult.
Mm-hmm. Can I just say something? I'm a jaded minister, so I used to always had like I want to change the hearts of men, you know, men and women. I no longer want to change your heart. I want to change your behavior. And the way that I can change your behavior is to have laws in place, policy in place. Right. And that's exercising that stubborn model, that muscle that doesn't want to change. Now, if it gets to your heart, I call that an amen moment. But I'm not waiting for that. I'm hoping that the policy will help change your behavior, like the Me Too movement. Here, you know, it will, listen, they still might be misogynist, may never be able to eradicate it. I'm all right with it. But you know this much, if you harass me, you will lose your job. You will have no power. And that's all I can think of.
Yeah.
But I think that's really interesting because I agree. But one thing that we know, I think policy is important, but you have to make accountability for the policy. Because at the end of the day, there's policies out there and nothing changes that much. So the next step is, I agree with
that's
you,
good.
is
That's
push it
good.
forward.
Yeah, Jennifer, do you want to add anything to that?
That was so beautifully said. I don't know what to add except to say that I think those of us who are white have work to do in our families and in our communities. You know, I think that these conversations are painful and difficult, but we have to have them. We have to commit ourselves to having them. And when I think about how social movements have changed, and I think about like the Young Lords was one of the movements I teach a lot in my classes, and it's 1970s. It was centered in Puerto Rican communities in Chicago, Philly, and New York City. But it was a very multi-ethnic movement. It brought in folks from the Dominican Republic, from Cuba, from European immigrants, as well as African Americans. And the way they dealt with internalized racism and sexism within the movement was they talked about it with each other. And it was painful and it was difficult, but they talked about it with each other. And they also, I think, one thing the women taught me is that they focused on the younger men because they felt like they still looked up to them, and they were learning, their minds were open, their hearts were open, they were willing to learn and to see how these systems ultimately, even though they benefit from them, are, you know, if one person's oppressed, all of us are oppressed, right? So I think that model for me of like, how do we raise children differently? How do we have these kinds of difficult conversations in our family? How do we call people out in ways that don't shut them down? But because that, I think, to me is, right? It's not going to work. People just get more rigid in their positions. So
I think, do we have time for one more question?
I think it was the problem with the 2016 election and those 53% of women who voted for Trump. I think a lot of them were voting against Hillary and not for Trump.
Right.
And that's a huge problem among my age bracket in the late 60s, early 70s, because they were used to being oppressed when they were getting into the job market, and they had older women who were discriminating against them. It just created a lot of cross-generational anger against other women, and we need to do something about that. The other thing I want to say is the Electoral College. There's the white women who go up to New Hampshire. It's because New Hampshire matters. Massachusetts, except for Ayanna Pressley.
yeah.
Just in wrapping, I think we can all agree that next time we bring a friend. We will bring a friend who needs to hear this, because this is a topic of conversation that we should be having more frequently with our friends and family, constantly, in order to really make change, right? So I want to thank everyone for being here. I think we have some closing remarks.
It's a challenging thing as I'm sitting here trying to think about how to give final comments and final thoughts on this, particularly as a white woman, as I'm really thinking about that. I think the comments that I just want to say is really, what I'm sort of saying as final thoughts is that we really do need to think about suffrage in really new ways. It's not, and to me, I've been thinking about sort of enfranchising groups and groups that are marginalized, but I'm also, what I'm really understanding is that there's lots of people that were they were active. Their story just wasn't being told and hasn't been told. I think I was really moved by the comment of, black women empower their community, and white women, at least at the time of the 19th Amendment enactment, were upholding its community, and that is white supremacy. And it still is white supremacy. We maybe sometimes call it white privilege, but let's be honest, it really is white supremacy. And it's important for people like me, like us, a lot of people that are white in this audience, that we are addressing it and not having other people have to give voice to it. We have to give voice to this ourselves and talk to our communities, and continue the conversation is what I'm really hearing. In the continuing, I do want to say also, I love the, acknowledging the complete and whole truth is an act of kindness. I loved your opening comment, but I think that is really, there's really truth to that. I do want to acknowledge that the Cambridge Public Library is hosting Robin DiAngelo, who is the author of White Fragility, and she will be here on Saturday, January 18th, so there's more to come about that. So thank you for bringing that up. And there'll be more conversations to come. We hope that in January or February there'll be another session, and then as we get closer to August and the actual 100th year anniversary, we'll be continuing the conversations. So thank you all for coming. Really appreciate the discussion.
Yeah, I want to thank the Reverend Irene Monroe, Dr. Lori Messiah Jefferson, and Dr. Jennifer Guglielmo for this wonderful panel. Thank you all for coming.